You might think you know Will Eisner, but here are 12 facts you may not have known about the namesake of comics' top awards. William Irwin Eisner was born March 6, 1917, in Brooklyn, New York, the son of Jewish immigrants. He would go on to become one of comics' greatest innovators and artists on such works as The Spirit and A Contract with God. He passed away at the age of 87 on January 3, 2005. Eisner went to high school and was friends with Bob Kane, the credited creator of Batman. Kane was the one who suggested to Eisner, who had contributed illustrations to the school newspaper, magazine, and yearbook, that he draw comics for a new comic book called Wow, What a Magazine in 1936, when Eisner was 19. WOW lasted for only 4 issues, after which Eisner and the book's editor, Jerry Iger, formed a studio, the Eisner and Iger Studio, in which they and others created pre-packaged comics for publishers such as Fox Comics and Quality Comics. Artists who worked at the Eisner-Iger Studio included Jack Kirby, Wally Wood, and Lou Vine. Eisner would often use pseudonyms to make his studio seem like it had more artists than it did, including Willis Renzi and W. Morgan Thomas. During his time at the studio, Eisner created or co-created such characters as Dollman, Black Hawk, Uncle Sam, Black Condor, and Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. Eisner's most famous work was creating a comic book insert for newspapers that included such strips as Mr. Mystic, Lady Luck, and his most famous creation, The Spirit, which ran from 1940 through 1952. One of Eisner's biggest innovations was his use of splash pages, which are large, often full-page illustrations that set the mood or scene for a comic story. The Spirit is famous for its beautifully designed splashes, which often incorporated the logo of the strip into their design. Eisner was drafted into the Army in 1941 as the U.S. prepared to enter World War II. Eisner's major contribution to the Army was using his skill as a cartoonist to draw instructional cartoons, including a strip called Joe Dope for the magazine Army Motors. After The Spirit concluded, Eisner would create more educational cartoons for the Army with P.S. The Preventative Maintenance Monthly and others. In addition to creating groundbreaking comics, Eisner was also a teacher and writer about the art of comics. He would frequently lecture at the School of Visual Arts, and later wrote 2 books based on these lectures, Comics and Sequential Art and Graphic Storytelling and Visual Narrative. It was in these books that he coined the term sequential art, still used today to describe comics. Although he didn't invent the term or the form, Eisner is credited with popularizing the graphic novel with his 1978 work, A Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories. Most of his work after this was longer-form single-volume stories, which he continued producing well into his 80s at a rate of almost a book a year. Eisner's latter-era work focused on themes surrounding New York's immigrant population, Jewish culture, or both. Examples include The Building, Dropsy Avenue, the semi-autobiographical The Dreamer, and Fagin the Jew, a retelling of Dickens' Oliver Twist. His final work was The Plot, The Secret Story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a history and refutation of an insidious anti-Semitic hoax. Comics' most prestigious awards are the Eisner Awards, named, of course, after Will Eisner. The awards have been given out at San Diego Comic-Con since 1988, and Eisner himself was a regular attendee at the awards ceremony until his death. He was one of 3 inaugural inductees into the Will Eisner Award Hall of Fame, together with Carl Barks and Jack Kirby in 1987. Eisner also won a host of awards not named after him, including but by no means limited to the National Cartoonist Society Comic Book Award 5 times, as well as a Story Comic Book Award and a Reuben Award from the NCS, placement in the Academy of Comic Book Arts and Jack Kirby Halls of Fame, and the second ever Grand Prix Award at the Angoulême Comics Festival in 1975.
Sequential art, which is what I call the art of comics, is the arrangement of pictures in a sequence to tell a story. What we do, what is being done in this comic medium, is to take a seamless flow of action, say, for example, a man walking across the street and falling into a manhole, for example. So we start off...
An unusual situation.
Well, to say the least. We start off with the understanding that there are maybe 500 actions between that man walking across the street and going down there. What we have to do...
500 manholes in New York. All right, go ahead. What do you have to do?
Stand.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to take you seriously.
Don't ever do
walking,
that.
What we do is select out of the 500 little all totally connected, unseparated actions. We select those actions which we can use to show the action itself. Now, what sequential art depends on is an intellectual understanding between you and the reader. So we have the man walking down the street here with a bow tie, and between him and here, there's another action in which he's perhaps looking back at somebody back there.
Who said, how come you're wearing that bow tie?
Yeah, well, you know, hey, Charlie, what are you wearing that bow tie for?
See, I know you never do anything without a reason. And when you said there's a man with a bow tie, you had to have established that for some reason, I figure.
That's what makes you the great editor you are.
Go ahead.
You understand. So he's walking down here, and he
Looking
looks
back.
back. Now, and then in the third action here, he falls into the sewer, and I leave his hat hanging, flying up in the air.
Oh,
Now,
I see what you mean. He turned around so he didn't see the open manhole.
That's right.
He's fallen, and there's the hat. Right. Okay, great.
Clever of you to figure this out, Stan.
Well, you said it was an intellectual arrangement somehow between
So
them.
now, what I've done here really is selected out of a whole series of actions which would normally occur in a motion picture film. A moving picture frame would be something like several hundred frames for this action, and selected from this into that. And this is what is known as sequential art, because there's a sequence of events between this picture and that.
Well, you referred to comic book artwork as sequential art, don't you?
Exactly, exactly. There's a textbook I wrote on it, which I use to this day to teach from, builds on that point. I felt that for the first time, somebody had to sit down and create a discipline out of this art. When I started, as I said earlier, there were no schools. Nobody taught this subject. And I think it was necessary to do this. And I think it had to go beyond. I wanted to go beyond how to draw feet, how to draw ears and noses.
Yeah, obviously, you've never studied how to draw feet.
No, I've left it out. I think they go like this.
I thought you were starting out with Charlie Chaplin.
Well,
no, but actually, it's very clear.
I did this so that it's so.
You've got the
simply,
action beautifully. Anybody can tell.
At any rate,
yeah.
That represents the kind of action. Now, part of the importance of the work I do, to me, that is the importance of the scene itself, is the human action. I spend a lot of time developing emotion. I believe that emotion comes not necessarily from the face, picturing the face, but rather than the body. We show our emotions with our body.
Body language.
Body language, if you will. So that, to me, it's very important to be able to develop that. And I spend a lot of time, I do a lot of erasing. I'll start figuring and play with it until I get it to precisely exactly that, because I'm in constant contact with the reader. Remember that I am writing a story to a reader. I'm telling a reader a story. And I have to connect with the reader's life experience and his understanding of what it is that will convey or transmit an emotion. And I fell into this magazine, Wow. And as I said, the magazine collapsed after 2 issues, but I realized something very interesting was happening, and that is the comic magazines, as we called them in those days, didn't call them comic books, were being produced by the publishers who had been publishing the pulp magazines. Now, pulp magazines were dying at the same time.
As a teenager, he just had a sense that there was an opportunity there. He dismisses it as being particularly brilliant. He said anybody who was there could have seen the opportunity. He said, one time he said, it was raining and I had a bucket. So he started this business.
I picked up the phone and I called Iger, and I said to him, meet me downtown, I got an idea. So we met at a little beanery around on 43rd Street between Lexington and 2nd Avenue. And I said to Iger, look, it's very obvious that these guys are using daily comic strips to fill their magazines, but there are only about 50 or 60 daily strips in the whole country, of which maybe 50% of them or 30% of them are adventure strips. I have an idea to start a studio producing original material. Well, he said, it's going to take money. He said, I don't have any money. I said, look, I figured it out. I know where we can rent an office for $5 a month. It's on 41st Street and Madison Avenue on the corner. I've just sold a commercial job. I had about $10, and my father loaned me, he had another $5 that he could loan me, enough to pay for 3 months' rent. He was about 13 years older than me, so he knew his way around, and I said, "You're a businessman, you can go out and do the selling, and I'll produce the work." We agreed that then the company would be called Eisner and Eiger. My name was first because I was putting up the money. Well, we're leaving the restaurant. The check came to $1.90, and I had $1.95 in my pocket, which I had a nickel left to get the subway up to the Bronx. So I paid the check, and we walked out, and as we were walking down the street, he turned to me, and he said, "You know, it's not very nice." He said, "You didn't leave a tip." So from then on, he said to me, "You know, you're a very tight-fisted fella." So we opened this office, and he went out and began selling these pulp magazines. There were pulp publishers who were looking for comic books. Let's go back to Eisner and Eiger.
Okay, great.
Because that was really where we first met, where we got started. Both of us got started
Yes.
there. Eisner and Eiger in those days, I know I was hiring at anybody I could get who could draw, we were desperate for at the time. In the studio at Eisner and Eiger, Eisner and Eiger had about 14 or 15 artists working on salary full time.
The guys who came in early into the business were those, first of all, who were ashamed to even say that they were working for comic books. This was completely and totally a junk medium. Magazines like Collier's and Saturday Evening Post, who had the top illustrators and artists working for them, were slowly being phased out. And other kinds of publications were coming to the fore, so that the artists were really looking, some of them were really looking desperately for work. One of the places that they could pick up work, easy stuff, was in comic books.
What Eisner and Eiger did, and what a few other people at the same time did, was actually get the young artists in the room. So you find guys who have very little training and are young and will work really cheap. You get some cheap office space, and you line them up, and you line up a job. You get some pulp publisher or someone who wants to try a comic book, and he says, "I'll pay you this much to give me 64 pages of publishable comics." And then it's the job of this bunch of kids to produce those 64 pages. And you figure out who does the neatest lettering, who does pencil art better, and who does ink art better, and who can actually make up a story that makes sense, and who can make up good names for characters, and you just kind of pass it around.
Well, I guess I was impressed that Will had gathered so many talents who later became very talented, including Lou Fine and others who worked in the studio. I didn't realize he was that much of an entrepreneur, businessman at that time.
And Will would walk up and down the aisles of this bullpen, basically telling these other kids, say, redraw that, do this, do that.
I admire people who know what they're doing. I felt that you and Jerry were those kind of people. Anything you told me to do, I would have done, because I felt that I was learning something. I wanted to learn how to be good, so I could never go back to that ghetto again.
Sometime in fall of '39, Busy Arnold and Henry Martin called me up. Henry Martin was a registered Tribune, and they said, "We want to do a comic supplement." It was called a Ready Print in those days, and wanted me to produce it. And Busy said the condition was that I produce it independently.
This was at the latter part of '39?
Early '39.
Surprising to me.
Summer of '39.
Yeah.
I was then partners with Jerry Eiger in Eisner and Eiger. I realized it would be a conflict of interest. I couldn't do that. Busy Arnold and Jerry Eiger were not very close.
Okay.
All right?
All right. I understand.
But it wasn't purely a personality question. Busy Arnold had a partner, the syndicate, and they made a condition that it was not to be done by a commercial shop. It had to be done by an individual, because the syndicate thought that way. So I struck a deal with Busy Arnold, and I said, under no conditions will I come unless we form a deal. I would form the partnership. I would own the strip.
And the fact that he had ownership in the Spirit was also pretty much unprecedented. You can count on, one hand the cartoonists who owned or were able to acquire the rights to their own strip. So again, in his early 20s, he had enough foresight to say, I'll do this, but I want equity in it.
Most of us did not know anything about rights, percentages. We didn't come from that culture. You know, if we had come from, I think the editors knew more, because most of the top editors came from the pulps. So they certainly had more of a business sense of the value of art and story. But most of the, myself and the colleagues who started in the comics were naive about that. Many of us, it was the first time we had sold our work.
When Siegel and Schuster sold Superman to DC, or let's say had Superman published by DC, they reportedly got a check for $130, which was $10 a page for 13 pages. And it did not include any payment for the rights. It was simply payment for the pages. And there was an implication that in buying the pages, they bought everything that was in the pages, including the intellectual property and the copyright. And many of these guys, including Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, were just storytellers. They wanted to make things up, draw pictures, get their names in print, and make a living at it. And unfortunately, in the process, laid themselves wide open to exploitation.
Anyway, I went to Iger and I said to Jerry, look, we had a buy-sell agreement. Either you buy me out or I buy you out, but I have to, I want to go off and do this thing. Jerry said, you're crazy, there's no future, et cetera, it may not work. At any rate, it wasn't a toss of the coin. Jerry said, I'll buy you out. So I sold Eisner and Iger to Jerry.
I gave it to him cheap because I didn't care then. I was going into something that I felt was worthwhile. Because by then, I had realized that for me, this was going to be my life's work.
One thing that Will told me years ago about how he was looking at Milton Caniff, at Terry and the Pirates, and wistfully wishing he was better than, or at least as good as that. Not sure that he was, but sure that he was better than all of his comic book compatriots. He had to find a niche somewhere between the two. And so he invented a comic book that could be sold with the newspaper, finding a newspaper audience to see what he could do better than anybody else, which is to take advantage of the fact that each page of a comic book is a surprise that hides the page after, so that the fertility of Will's imagination could find a platform appropriate to it.
A kid was most likely to buy a comic book. However, newspapers went to homes where parents and children both read them. And I think he felt enough adults would pick the spirit out of that pile if it was a good read. I think he wrote to that audience. He stopped writing to the 14-year-old in Iowa, and he started writing the spirit for an adult audience.
But comics, I believe very strongly, and I'm committed personally to this, are emerging from a kind of folk literature or cheap literature to a quality literary form. There's certainly a distinct relationship between film and comics. I like to think of comics as a film on paper. I have always maintained that in the beginning, God made comics. Then he made film. Film is an extension of comics. Comics is an attempt to communicate with the visual form. When the spirit began to revive in the 70s, my astonishment when Phil Suling called me up and asked me to come down to attend a convention, the first convention in New York, and I found that there were people there who were reading the Spirit. I remember Dennis Kitchen came over to me and asked me if he could reprint Spirit stories. I said, "Do you really want to do that?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, who'd be interested? The character's been dead. He's been in a box for the last 20 years. I must confess, it's a very rewarding thing. It's not every cartoonist or artist who can see a character that he created or see something he created survive to another generation. The Spirit was an anti-hero because I never took the whole idea of the superhero seriously. The fact that he wore a mask was a concession I made much against my better judgment, really my instinctive desire to deal with the hero. I was looking for realism in my stories. Actually, the Spirit stories were stories in which the Spirit only played a part of it, rather than the story built around any particular strengths that he might have. For me, the waterfront represented a marvelous opportunity for settings. Many of the stories I did used the waterfront almost as a key to the total story. Generally, the prime action, the denouement of the story occurred on the waterfront for me because here is where the criminals were either caught entering or escaping. And the waterfront represented that throughout the whole. I guess if you would want to summarize the position of the waterfront in all the Spirit stories I ever did, you might say that it was the entrance staging area for most of the adventure stories. My orientation is essentially theater, that is live theater and stage set. My father was, after all, a scenery painter. And my earliest impressions, theatrical impressions at any rate, came from live theater and remained with me throughout. I'm probably more influenced by my memory of theater than I am of film, because film is, after all, not really connected with a closed-in scene. It doesn't have the feel and the smell of a contained dimension. By introducing the weather elements like rain, extreme rain, or fog or snow, I can enhance the element of danger and bring to the reader a greater element of personal contact. It enables me to reach the reader a little bit more easily, emotionally. The city has influenced my lighting, my thinking of lighting and containment tremendously. I always thought of light coming from above. All my experience has been in the city, in narrow streets where your source of light was either a lamppost or a light of the sunshine filtered down through the space between two buildings or an alley. Strong women were things that I always admired. I was always attracted to women who were competent and skillful and people in themselves. There's so much in a city like New York City, which after all occupies the position of being central city in most of my stories. And in the later work that I've done outside of the Spirit, the portfolio called The Big City, and then ultimately a 132-page book of vignettes of the city called The City. All of these are built around the areas of the city where all kinds of action can take place. Stories emerge from almost any portion of a city you can think of. For example, a city throws off a tremendous amount of debris, garbage, junk, all of it left over from the city. Each of these pieces are a story within themselves. You can't even over-dramatize the fact that you can walk into a portion of the city that's partially abandoned, pick up old beer cans and bits of debris, and find a story right there on the spot. This is the element with which I work, and this makes the fiber of the large part of most of the body of my work. The city for me is really not only the setting, but the source of story material. Generally, I do not use photographic research. I try very hard to work from memory because I'm dealing with a form of impressionism. Very few of us remember things in a clear, highly detailed fashion. And most of our adventure and experiences leave the backgrounds in a form of a blur, which leave for us an impression, and this is what I try to convey. I spent around 25 years in a company that I owned, publishing and utilizing comics or sequential art as a teaching tool. I did an awful lot of those during the period between 1955 and 1970. We did a lot for the school system in the United States, and also for the Department of Defense. I first discovered the use of comics during World War II when I was involved in the training area where they had to train people very rapidly in procedural matters. And I've discovered that I had a tool in my hand that was very, very useful, and it worked beautifully. Poorhouse Press was a publishing company I started shortly after I sold my educational publishing companies. That was an attempt on my part to publish books that nobody would publish. Gleeful Guides was just a series of humorous books I felt I wanted to do sometime, and I did them. Over the last 6 or 7 years, I've produced something like 4 or 5 graphic novels. Graphic novel generally takes me about 1.5 years to do, from writing stage to actual execution. I work fairly fast, but I spend a lot of time in thinking out a story and working out the plot. Contract with God, and particularly Life Force, which I've just completed, as I said, is built on a historical frame. It's an attempt to tell history of life in the city, particularly in the Bronx, in the middle 30s during the Depression, which is a very interesting period of time, not necessarily exciting, but a very interesting period of time for me because I lived through it. As far as the employment of Jewish culture, this stems from the fact that I'm more familiar with Jewish culture than I am with any other culture, and I employ it because it's something I know and I understand.
America looks for answers after the space shuttle explodes in a ball of fire.
Coming up, the experts try to explain this country's worst space disaster.
Life on Another Planet was a political statement. There's no question about it. I had a political statement in mind, and it's very rare that I have been doing anything but social commentary. I've always seem to me have been in a teaching posture because I ran a studio largely composed of new artists, people who have come in from other fields. Back in 1938, when I started Eisner and Eiger, most of the members of that studio were people who came from other fields. They were painters who found a job in comics. They were illustrators who found a job in comics. So I was always teaching, it seemed to me, along with getting production. As far as the whole idea of teaching a new generation, I find it very exciting and very important from a selfish point of view, from a career selfish point of view, because the more people I feel that get interested in this field and approach this field seriously and professionally, the better will be the product. Opportunity came along and someone bought the company out from under me, and I then decided I would continue on as doing my own creative thing. I remember sitting in the kitchen talking to my wife, and she said to me, "Well, what are you going to do now?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Maybe I'll find another publishing company and start a new publishing company." She said, "Why don't you do what you always said you were going to do? Here's your chance to either put up or shut up." So I always used to say, one of these days I'm going to get rid of all this business stuff and settle down and write and draw. Well, I did. I bought a house in White Plains and with a studio next door, and began writing and drawing. Now I'm in Florida doing the same thing and enjoying myself.